Cages stood in the backyard. My pigeons, my hobby, my escape. I loved watching them fly, return home, and trust me, I cared for them, fed them, and looked after their health. To me, they were more than just birds, but something was wrong this morning. I stepped outside and immediately felt uneasy. Something had changed. Then I saw the cages. They were open, empty. My heart pounded as I walked closer. The locks weren't broken, the bars were intact. Nothing had been stolen. The doors were simply left open, and the pigeons were gone. I clearly remembered checking everything before bed last night. I had locked the cages, just as I always did. Only one person could have done this: Karen. She had been after my pigeons for a long time. Endless complaints, constant grievances. She had threatened me with fines, lawyers, and vowed to find a way to get rid of them. And now, it seemed, she had. I took a deep breath, forcing down my anger. Karen thinks she's won, but she doesn't know that pigeons always come back, and this time they'll bring a real disaster with them. A few weeks ago, I finally fulfilled my childhood dream. I got pigeons. I had wanted to do this for a long time, but there were always excuses. No time, no space, too many responsibilities. But deep down, I knew it would happen sooner or later. Because to me, pigeons aren't just birds. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I was just a child. My world was on the verge of a great loss. My mother was gravely ill. The doctors were powerless, and the house was filled with silence, broken only by her weak breathing. I didn't understand why this was happening. I couldn't accept that she might leave. One day, I was sitting by my bedroom window. It was open. I needed fresh air. And then it happened. A pigeon flew into my room. It landed on my bed and looked at me with dark, watchful eyes. I wasn't scared. On the contrary, at that moment, it felt like a sign. I looked at it and whispered,
"Please, fly to God and ask him to save my mother."
The pigeon stared at me for a few more seconds. Then, it lifted off and flew out the open window. I didn't know if it would help, but I felt lighter. And a few days later, a miracle happened. My mother got better. The doctors couldn't explain it. They said her condition had suddenly improved, that her body was somehow fighting the illness. But I knew the truth. I knew my messenger had fulfilled its mission. From that day on, I promised myself I would help pigeons. And now, years later, I have kept that promise. I have my own pigeons. They trust me, and I take care of them. But not everyone understands. But there was one person who didn't like it: Karen. She couldn't stand the fact that my pigeons flew over her house. She swore it was dangerous. Every flight was a catastrophe in her eyes. She constantly came up with new reasons to complain.
"They fly over my house. It's dangerous,"
she would tell me the moment my little flock took to the sky.
"Do you know how many diseases they carry?"
she declared, as if I hadn't taken every precaution to keep my pigeons healthy.
"I don't like the way they look."
Yes, she even said that, as if they weren't living creatures but something unpleasant and unnecessary. The next time she came, it wasn't with her usual moralizing or insults. She came with official documents in hand. That made me wary. This was an attack.
"You're violating the HOA code. It clearly states, 'No livestock or poultry allowed.'"
She pointed to a line underlined in red marker. I glanced at the papers and everything became clear. They were just ordinary sheets with handwritten text that looked completely fake. "Karen, pigeons aren't livestock. They're not backyard chickens. They don't fall under this rule. They're my pets. They're not bothering anyone," I said, trying to stay calm, knowing this so-called document wasn't worth taking seriously. She started waving more papers around, trying to look serious, but I already knew. It was all just smoke and mirrors. All these so-called documents were just another attempt to manipulate the situation.
"Find yourself another hobby, because I'll find a way to get rid of your pigeons. And if that means fines or lawyers, I won't stop,"
she threatened again before storming off. Karen wasn't going to stop. She had already decided that my pigeons were her personal problem, and I was ready for this to be just the beginning of her fight. One morning, just as the sun was touching the horizon, I stepped into my yard and froze. My pigeons, they were gone. The cages stood wide open, and the birds had vanished without a trace. The locks weren't broken. Nothing else was missing. Just the pigeons. Flown away. I clearly remembered locking the cages the night before. There was no way they could have opened on their own. I searched the yard, walked around the property, but there wasn't a single clue as to how this had happened. My gut told me one thing: Karen. I knew she had to be behind this. There was no other explanation for how all my pigeons had disappeared so quickly and without a sign. I went to her house to get the truth. "Did you release my pigeons?" I asked, looking her straight in the eyes. Karen didn't even try to hide it. She smiled, a smug, cynical smile. She wasn't even pretending to be innocent.
"Aw? Do you have proof?"
She replied, glancing at me mockingly.
"No pigeons, no evidence, so just forget about them."
Then, smirking again, she added,
"I told you I'd find a way to get rid of those filthy creatures. Now we have clear skies."
I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't yell. I didn't get angry. I just looked her in the eyes and said quietly, "You don't understand one thing. Pigeons always come back." She was convinced she had won, but I knew this wasn't over. That night, while Karen slept, I prepared a special feed. It was completely safe for the birds, but had one interesting effect. It caused severe diarrhea. Silently, I snuck into her yard and scattered the feed everywhere. Near the porch, along the pathways, over the flower beds, right onto her beloved lawn. I even sprinkled a bit on her car for maximum impact. The job was done. Now all I had to do was wait. One by one, the pigeons began to return. As always, they came looking for food, but this time they found it not in my yard, but on Karen's property. Satisfied, I went back home. Tomorrow was going to be an interesting day. The morning began with a scream, sharp, piercing, filled with fury and despair. I stepped onto the porch and saw it. Karen's yard, destroyed. Her once perfect lawn now looked like a battlefield. The flower beds she had so carefully tended were now covered in a thick layer of white and gray pigeon droppings. Her car was splattered and streaked as if it had been doused in paint. And at the center of all this chaos stood Karen. She was waving her arms, screeching, trying to chase off the dozens of pigeons that were peacefully perched on her roof, her fence, her car, and even her mailbox. But every sharp movement only provoked them, and new gifts fell right on top of her. Karen looked marvelous.
You!
She spun toward me, her eyes blazing with hatred.
You did this!
I casually leaned on the fence, watching her panic unfold. Me? I raised an eyebrow. I told you, pigeons always come back.